The diner was packed that evening, the usual crowd of truckers, families, and tired travelers filling up the booths and counter seats. The neon sign outside flickered slightly, casting a dim glow on the cracked pavement. It wasn't a fancy place, by any means, just a simple roadside restaurant where people came for decent food and a warm cup of coffee. Jessica had been working there for almost 2 years. She had seen all kinds of customers come and go, from polite regulars to entitled. Tourists who thought leaving a $1 tip was a grand gesture. The work wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. She had long since stopped caring about making small talk with the patrons, giving most of them the bare minimum level of service required. It was just another job to her, another shift to get through. That night, as she refilled the sugar dispensers and wiped down the counter, the door swung open, and an older man in a dusty leather jacket stepped inside. He looked like he had seen better days, his face weathered and his posture slightly slouched. He carried himself with a certain ease, though, like he had been around long enough to know how to handle himself in any situation. Jessica barely gave him a glance before turning back to her work. He found a seat at the far end of the counter and picked up a menu, his fingers tracing the edges absently. When Jessica finally walked over, her voice was flat, her patience already running thin from the long shift. "What'll it be?" The man looked up, his gaze steady but calm. "Coffee. Black." She turned without a word, grabbed the pot from the warmer, and poured him a cup. The coffee was strong, probably too strong, but he didn't complain. Instead, he took a slow sip, as if savoring it. Jessica drummed her fingers on the counter, waiting for him to decide on his order. "Anything else?" The man glanced at the menu again, then set it down. "Burger, medium, no onions." "Fries?" "Sure." She scribbled the order on her notepad and ripped off the slip, pinning it up in the kitchen window. The cook, a burly man named Danny, grunted in acknowledgement and went to work. Jessica leaned against the counter, arms crossed, waiting for the food to be ready. The man at the counter didn't say much, just drank his coffee and occasionally looked around the diner. He seemed familiar somehow, but she couldn't place where she had seen him before. Probably just another old guy passing through like so many others. After a few minutes, the burger was ready, and she set the plate in front of him. "Enjoy," she muttered, not really meaning it. The man nodded, picked up the burger, and took a bite. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully, then took another sip of his coffee. Jessica watched him out of the corner of her eye, still trying to figure out why he looked so familiar. "You work here long?" he asked casually. She shrugged. "Long enough." "Like it?" Jessica scoffed. "Not really. Pays the bills." The man nodded again, as if he understood something deeper than she had meant to convey. He took another bite of his burger, finishing it off in a few more bites. When he was done, he pushed the plate aside and leaned back slightly, looking around. "The diner again," Jessica sighed, waiting for him to ask for the check so she could move on to the next customer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. He slid out a few bills and set them on the counter, more than enough to cover the meal. Jessica picked them up and turned toward the register when the sound of a voice behind her made her freeze. "Clint! Didn't know you were in town!" She turned slowly, her heart sinking as she saw the restaurant's manager, Mike, walking over with a big grin on his face. The old man, Clint, stood up and shook Mike's hand with an easy familiarity. "Figured I'd drop by," Clint said, his voice calm but carrying a weight of authority. "Checking in on the place." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. Checking in? What did that mean? She stared at them, confusion twisting in her gut. Mike clapped Clint on the shoulder. "Always good to see you. Everything up to standard?" Clint chuckled. "Could use a little more hospitality." Jessica felt her face flush hot as realization hit her like a freight train. Clint wasn't just some random customer. He wasn't just another old guy passing through. He owned the diner. Her stomach tightened. Had she been rude? Probably. Had she treated him like she did every other customer she didn't care about? Absolutely. Mike turned to her, still smiling, but with an edge of something else in his eyes. "Jess, you met the owner yet?" Jessica swallowed hard, forcing herself to nod. "Didn't realize," she mumbled. Clint studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he simply smiled, a knowing glint in his eyes. "No harm. Done." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, nodding slightly. Mike, still oblivious to the tension in the air, clapped his hands together. "Well, let me know if you need anything, Clint." "Always a pleasure." Clint gave a small nod and turned back to Jessica. "Thanks for the coffee." And with that, he walked toward the door, his boots echoing softly against the tiled floor. Jessica watched him go, her stomach still in knots. She had no idea what that meant for her job, but one thing was for sure. She would never look at customers the same way again. Over the next few weeks, Clint continued to stop by. He never said much, but his presence became a regular occurrence. Jessica found herself looking forward to his visits, eager to prove that she had learned from their first encounter. Slowly, the diner itself seemed to change as well. Other employees started following suit, putting in a little more effort, taking pride in their work. It was a ripple effect, one that started with a simple cup of coffee and a lesson in humility. One evening, as Jessica wiped down the counter, Clint placed a folded piece of paper beside his coffee cup. He nodded toward it before taking his last sip. Curious, she picked it up and unfolded it. It was a handwritten note. "Hard work and respect go a long way. Keep at it." Clint. Jessica smiled as she tucked the note into her apron pocket. Maybe this job wasn't just about paying the bills after all. Weeks later, Clint made another unexpected move. He pulled Mike aside for a quiet conversation. Soon after, Mike called Jessica into his office. "Jess," he said, "Clint's been watching you. He thinks you have potential. He wants to promote you to shift supervisor." Jessica's eyes widened. The girl who once barely tolerated her job was now being recognized for her efforts. She looked toward the diner, feeling something she hadn't in a long time: pride. And somewhere at the counter, Clint sat back, sipping his coffee, knowing his lesson had made a difference.